Hi, and welcome to our very first on-demand webinar. Today, we're going to be learning about how to understand your forage report from the perspective of a beef cattle producer. My name is Rebecca Kern-Lunbery. I've been with Ward Laboratories as the forage testing consultant for 8 years now, and I'm really excited today to go over the items in our forage reports and what they mean for your beef cattle, as well as some new features that we've rolled out recently. So let's get started. So first, when we're looking at forages, typically everything is going to be reported on a percent basis. So I found this square image online, and I should have found and given credit to whoever put this together. But ultimately, this is just a really great depiction of all the different components and parameters that you're going to see on your report that make up that forage and the characteristics of the forage. And so when we are testing forages with beef cattle in mind, we're really usually testing to see how we want to mix a ration. If we're on the feedlot side of things, or if we're on the cow-calf side of things, we're honestly looking at supplementation, whether that's protein and energy needs or our mineral supplementation as well. So first, we're going to take a look at dry matter and moisture. So pretty straightforward. Moisture is the amount of water in the feed, and dry matter is everything that's not water that's in that forage. When we are thinking about forage for beef cattle, especially hay, that's when we're really concerned about the moisture and the dry matter. Whenever we're comparing two hay samples, whether it's to feed or figuring out how we're going to mix it, or silage samples, we want to look at everything on the dry basis. If we are looking at the moisture basis, then that water can sometimes throw things off a little bit for us. So we want to make sure we're looking on the dry basis and then determining our supplementation strategy relative to our animals' needs or ration balancing relative to our animals' requirements, and then converting back to as received once we've just determined the proportions that need to be fed. Or if we're looking at purchasing hay, determining which one is best going to meet our animals' needs. Aside from that, with moisture and hay specifically, there is different levels, and the first thing that everyone's always most concerned with is if we're stacking hay bales, we need to keep it below 22% moisture. If it's greater than that, then it's more likely that we're going to have spontaneous combustion and have to deal with hay bale fires. Between 18 and 22%, spontaneous combustion isn't the biggest risk, but actually mold, mycotoxin issues can occur because it's the right conditions for those microbes to grow and produce those toxins or reproduce themselves. So that's what we need to be concerned about with those. And then 14 to 18% is the optimal range we want to see for hay bales. Of course, we can go into more specifics for round bales versus square bales. And then everything below 14% is considered brittle. The good thing about this is only about 12 to 13% of the forages that we test at Ward Labs do we ever see them being in that risk for mold or mycotoxins or for spontaneous combustion. So moving on, let's take a look at ash. So ash is all of the elements, all of the minerals that's contained in that feed. When we're talking about forages, whether it's fresh forages or hays, the ash content that naturally occurs in the plant and is coming from the plant is going to be 4 to 6%. So if you're testing your pasture grass, you're going to usually see around 4 to 6%. If you're testing your hay, however, with that raking process, getting it raked up into those windrows for baling, what we're going to actually typically see is 8 to 10%. And that's going to be with proper production practices for that hay in place. If over raking does occur, you're going to see your ash over 10%. And when you start to get greater than 10%, you should start to be concerned about soil contaminations and the deleterious effects that can have on animal health. In extreme cases, this can cause some gut impaction issues. So what makes up the ash is actually the minerals. The minerals are each of those individual elements, and each individual mineral can play a different role and have an effect on biological activity, and of course can have a major impact on our production potential and potential to reach genetic potential with those animals, assuming protein and energy is actually met. So with forages, typically what we're testing our minerals for is to formulate a supplementation plan. And unfortunately, I have had a lot of experience consulting with producers who are experiencing deficiency issues or toxicity issues. And the biggest deficiency I usually see is when they're just not thrifty. That's often going to be your zinc and your copper and your micronutrients, actually. So these really, even at the parts per million level, they play such a pivotal role in our animals' health and making sure on that good plane of nutrition. So this is just all the minerals that are available for testing through Ward Laboratories. I just want to highlight, along with our typical mineral package, we can also run chloride as salt, which we often do for mixer analysis, but that's not applicable for forage on your forage report. But on your forage report, if you're in a high selenium area, we can help you with that. So that's something you should be aware of, but it is an extra add-on. So I just want to pull this chart up, and this is all of the minerals that we do test at Ward Laboratories, with the exception of our, where did my mouse go? Oh, there it is, our iodine here. Okay, so iodine we aren't testing, but everything else on this, oh, and fluorine, that one escaped me, just like my mouse is. The fluorine. So those two we don't test, but you can see even with the ones that we do test and we do know about, you can see that there's a lot of interactions. And one of the main interactions that people are typically concerned about, producers, is this copper molybdenum interaction, but it should also be noted that copper and zinc also have an interaction. And it doesn't look like this is put on this, but actually copper and sulfur also have an interaction here as well, where it's binding up the copper and not allowing it to be absorbed. So with that, minerals are very important. We need to make sure that they're balanced in our diet, whether that's forages with a supplement or a total mixed ration based on our forages. And so it's just going to be key to test those forages and see where we're at on that. Overall, you can see with more minerals, there's even more possible potential interactions. These are all the minerals that are actually possibly present in animals' diet. So minerals can be quite tricky, and you can spend days learning about minerals and each individual mineral, what it does, and the animal health effects and production performance effects. So here we just want to call to the attention, staying on track talking about minerals, what we did here is we compiled mineral data from samples that were forages, ran wet chemistry minerals, and that's going to be really important here in a minute, and I'll explain that. But what we have is this table is everything submitted to us, and we broke it down based on the amount of protein in the forage, and we've got alfalfa, perennial grasses, annuals, small grains, warm seasons. So we've got quite a variety. Any of the dark shaded boxes means that more than 75% of the samples submitted to us require supplementation for that element. The lighter shaded boxes is between 50 and 75% of the samples submitted to us. And remember, all of these are producer samples. So what you can draw from the conclusion from this table here is, number one, we always need to be supplementing with zinc and copper. We're going to still test for them, but we need to be supplementing for them regardless. And then the other thing that you can see here is that there is a clear correlation between the need to supplement and the amount of protein that was in that forage. So we want to make sure when we are feeding beef cows, or if we're producing hay for beef cattle, that we want to be maximizing protein and remembering that forage quality, high forage quality, does go along with high mineral concentrations. And so we aren't going to need as much mineral supplements in our diet because of that. So just to show again the need to test this and to be certain of what you're feeding, this is the same data just broken down a little different way. This is just cherry picking out magnesium. We could show this for several other different minerals from this data set. But what we're showing is we've got the blue there is the requirement for a lactating beef cow, and the red is the maximum tolerable level for beef cattle. So what you can see in the grass hay and the legume hay is that those samples are highly variable. Some of the samples in the set meet requirements, some of them don't, some of them are above the maximum tolerable level. And so specifically for magnesium, we hear a lot about a high mag mineral versus a low mag mineral, and oftentimes we're mainly thinking about cover crops. Oh, they definitely need a high mag mineral, but when we actually look at it this way, our cover crops for the most part don't need a high mag mineral, but we do need to be testing some of our other forages to see, do they need more magnesium supplementation? Are they meeting our magnesium requirements? Or if we give them that high mag mineral just in case, are we going to end up actually causing ourselves to have a toxicity issue? Now, I mentioned earlier that we were only looking at samples ran wet chemistry. So here we have near-infrared spectroscopy, which is the method that we use to analyze the majority of the forages that come in our lab. And for all our macronutrients, this is a very, very great reproducible, repeatable method. But when it comes to minerals, we need to be running ICP OES, which is our wet chemistry method. And what we've got here, we've got calcium, phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium. On the y-axis, I've got the NIRS determinations for each of these values. Each little dot is a sample, and on the y value, on the x-axis, excuse me, we've got our wet chemistry determined values. If this had a good correlation, all of these samples should be lining up along that orange diagonal. That's the 1-to-1 line. We want an R squared of greater than 8, and ultimately we are not seeing that with these samples, so our lab will no longer be offering that data by NIR. But you can always get it wet chemistry, which is what we recommend. That's going to be your most accurate, reliable option. So just to kind of drive this point home, what I've got here is on the top of the chart, we've got our outliers. So these are samples that scanned as NIR, and they were identified to be samples that don't fit within that library or that calibration data set. Because of that, we at our lab, we guarantee accurate, reliable data. So we run crude protein, ADF, and NDF at no charge to our customers. So because these outliers, they're all ran by those methods, but what we found is that actually, based on the R squared and the average relative bias, those are actually fairly well correlated, and we would say that the NIR data coming off even on the outliers is good, accurate data. So that's excellent, excellent news, right? We can really trust the NIR for those macronutrients. And then, so the next block down, we've got our National Forage Testing Association samples, which we run wet chemistry and we run NIR. And so we did the same comparison of NIR versus wet chemistry. Again, our macronutrients look great. These aren't outliers. These are samples that definitely should be able to be run by NIR, and they are. I mean, look at the crude protein. You couldn't get closer to 1 than that for the R squared. But when you look at the minerals and the average relative bias, that's not acceptable for us. So then the third block down is those producer samples where they ran the wet chemistry and the NIR. And again, that average relative bias is not acceptable for the data coming out of our lab, or for you as the producer really to be making decisions based on, right? So if you're not going to run minerals, we recommend just use the book values, but we do recommend that you run the minerals and run them wet chemistry. So along with that, we have a really exciting new aspect on our report, which is that we are going to be providing mineral sufficiency levels specific to your species, your beef cattle, and then within that, specific to their physiological state. So what we need to know if you want these, if you're running minerals on a forage or a ration, today we're focused on forages, we need to know it's beef cattle. Are they lactating? Are they gestating? Or are they a grow finish? We don't have anything specific for bulls. We just throw them on the grow finish, I think. But then it'll tell you if you're in the ideal range, if you're deficient, if you're above the maximum tolerable level, or if you have with iron, molybdenum, and sulfur, do you have potential to be interfering with copper? So this can just help you to make some better decisions when it comes to your mineral supplement because you'll know where you already are. And some producers I've worked with, once they run these analysis, they might be able to get away with just providing that trace mineral salt, and they don't really need a full mineral supplement. But of course, you need to be working with experts, extension agents, nutritionists, your vet before you're making those kinds of decisions. We always recommend providing a good mineral and choosing your mineral based on what the forage needs. What is going to complement your forage best? Okay, moving on from ash and minerals and the elemental portions of the feed into our macronutrients. So our macronutrients, first we're going to talk about is fat, which we're just going to briefly touch on. Fat is not going to make up a big portion of your forages, but if you do have high quality forages, then the fat is going to carry some of your vitamins. Vitamin A has been a really hot topic. It's an expensive thing to be supplementing, so making sure that you have good fat, high quality forages, that's going to be key. And then fat also provides more energy than the carbohydrates in your forage. But again, it's not going to make up a large enough component to really make a huge difference. The next thing, and this is where we're going to really focus a lot of our time, is crude protein. So our forage reports now have a lot of different parameters that can help you describe your crude protein better than just as a percent of nitrogen, right? So first, let's define what protein is. So protein is actually amino acids, which are then linked together in a chain, and then they're folded and folded and folded into that protein structure. And that's really, truly what a protein is. And so it's important to know that protein, animals don't have a requirement for protein. What they have is a requirement for specific amino acids. And if you went to college and you studied animal science like me or some kind of biology degree, you certainly had to memorize some of these amino acids. And as you know, there's the ruminally protected amino acids out there now. Lysine is one of the common one that kind of pops in my head right now. But this is where the ideal protein idea came from, is that animals require amino acids. They don't necessarily require protein specifically. And so yes, the ruminally protected amino acids that I've already touched on, and in the swine industry and in the dairy industry, they're starting to implement more precision when it comes to navigating the protein in their diets, right? So we already touched on how protein is. But when you're looking at a lab report, you'll always see crude protein. And yes, it's crude. It's not measuring this quaternary protein structure that you see here at the end. It's actually measuring the percent of nitrogen, multiplying that by 6.25, and that's your estimate of crude protein content. Now, all the research, of course, is based on this. So when we are balancing diets, we are looking at matching up the crude protein needed by the animal's requirement with what's in the forage as a percent, right? So we do maybe need to adjust this some though. So next we're going to talk kind of about heat damage protein and how we can adjust our crude protein to improve our ration and supplementation strategies based off that information, but also introducing the metabolizable protein method. So when we're looking at heat damage protein, this is the protein that has adhered to the acid detergent fiber. And the acid detergent fiber, as we'll learn about later, is the most indigestible portion of, or slowly digestible and indigestible portion of the feed. So that's that amount of protein, the heat damage protein, if it's a ratio compared to the amount of crude protein between 0.14 and 0.2, you need to use this equation here shown to adjust your crude protein and then use that to balance your rations or to determine your protein supplementation needs. If the HGP to crude protein ratio is 0.2 or greater, then it's just straight crude protein minus the amount of heat damage protein, and use that as the way to balance your ration or determine your protein supplementation plan. Now, neutral detergent insoluble crude protein, I honestly don't think a lot of producers are going to be using this value, but we're going to leave it on the report because we never know what nutritionists might be looking for it. In some methods for balancing rations, they use the neutral detergent insoluble crude protein. So that's all the crude protein that's adhered to that neutral detergent fiber. And they subtract heat damage protein, and they use that as the estimate of the rumen undegradable protein. So that's rumen undegradable protein is the protein that passes through the rumen and goes straight to that small intestine to be digested and absorbed. Of course, after going through the abomasum and everything like that. Okay, so with that on our mind, that brings us to our next two parameters that you're going to see on our new reports. So when we're looking at the dietary crude protein, we just talked about our rumen undegradable protein, and NDICP minus HGP is one way that we can estimate the amount of protein that's undegradable. And so that's, again, bypass protein. It bypasses any digestion or modification by those gut microbes. And then we have rumen digestible protein, or RDP, which as soon as that hits the rumen, the microbes, they break it up into peptides, amino acids, ammonia. That ammonia can get turned into urea or back into microbial protein. That urea goes and is absorbed in the rumen wall, and we know that there's that nitrogen recycling that happens with beef cattle and other ruminants. And then we've got our peptides and amino acids that get redistributed back into being microbial protein. Both of these together, the rumen degraded protein that comes in as the microbial protein, and the undegraded protein, that's your metabolizable protein that's actually utilized by the animal. So in the lab situation, another way to estimate these two pieces of protein and where they're coming from is to run soluble protein. And so the soluble protein is the amount of protein that is removed by a laboratory solution that is supposed to simulate rumen degradation. And so that's representing the RDP fraction. And then insoluble protein is what's left on the filter, and that's what's estimating the rumen undegraded protein, or your bypass protein. And so this is going to help nutritionists. They can start using the metabolizable protein system. I haven't seen any great tools out there put out by Extension yet. I'm hoping to see some that would be awesome. The most recent version for the nutrient requirements of beef cattle, the 2016, this is what they recommend. And if you can use their balancer and decipher, they have a lot of information that needs put in there. If you can decipher it, that would be a great way to balance some rations. And I know some professional nutritionists are probably using the metabolizable protein diet. I have a quote here from an article that was essentially a research review of the metabolizable protein way of balancing rations. So it says, many research works have reported improved herd health, reproduction, and profitability when balancing using the metabolizable protein diet. So we have those added parameters on our reports, and a lot of people maybe aren't, producers specifically, aren't going to be using them. But the hope and the goal is that we're moving forward with the industry as they move towards balancing based on metabolizable protein as opposed to just crude protein. So we're really focused in on those different fractions of protein and what they're actually doing in the animal. And if you're using distillers to supplement your forage, that's kind of really, if you have a high quality forage, those distillers, they tout that it's a good bypass protein that is supposed to be very complementary to a high quality forage, right? Okay. So moving on, now we're going to talk about our soluble carbohydrates. So our non-fiber carbohydrates is another parameter you'll see on report. This is a calculated parameter, but it does include the starch, the ethanol-soluble carbs, and the water-soluble carbs. We aren't too concerned. We just know that these are soluble carbohydrates, and this is what gives that forage the energy to the animal, right, is having those carbohydrates. Starch isn't a big deal with most forages, but if we're looking at corn silage as a forage, then we do need to be paying attention to that starch value, especially if we're moving from feeding a silage that maybe was droughted out or didn't have as much corn grain because it was hailed out, or for whatever reason it didn't get a strong start, it was on dry land, whatever the reason, and then moving into feeding something that is of higher quality corn silage with the expected 30% starch, then we really need to start thinking about that forage almost as a mixed feed, and remembering that we can cause acidosis by moving too quickly between a low quality corn silage to that high quality corn silage based on that starch number being, I've seen as low as, like 12% all the way, 35 plus percent. Okay. All right, moving on, we're going to talk now about fibers. And fibers is very important in ruminant nutrition, and especially for beef cattle. So first we're going to talk about amylase-treated neutral detergent fiber. Now this fiber, what's really special about it is that it is inversely correlated with relative feed intake. So the higher the number for ANDF, the less that animal is going to want to consume. And the reason is because the longer it's going to take for that animal to really break down that fibrous feed. So the NDF consists of cellulose, hemicellulose, and then lignin. And cellulose and hemicellulose are slowly indigestible portions of the feed, and lignin is the most indigestible portions of the feed. So when that ANDF number gets above 60% for beef cattle, we need to really start watching them. If the report says that it meets their requirements or exceeds their requirements for crude protein and energy, that's going to be on a percent basis. It still might not be meeting their requirements on a pounds per day if they aren't able to consume as much as they need to. So if their dry matter intake drops, then even if on a percent of the diet everything's met, it's not met on a pounds per day basis. So that's when we really need to start being concerned. And so along with this number, I always like to look at our digestibilities. So the in vitro dry matter digestibility and the NDF digestibility. For forages, mainly I'm looking at the 48 hours. Some nutritionists may be looking at the 30-hour. And of course, if we're looking at other feeds, then we need to be looking at the 30-hour. Today, we're focused on forages again. So when I see a forage that is higher in that NDF, but if I see the digestibility is also high, which I'd say an average digestibility is going to be around 45, NDFD 48 around 45. If I see that that's higher, if it's 55, 60, then I know that even though that NDF is high, it's more composed of the cellulose and the hemicellulose, and it's more digestible, and so they probably will still meet their dry matter intake. But we still need to be monitoring them for body condition and everything like that. So, okay, we've hit NDF. Now let's talk a little bit about acid detergent fiber. And this is the least digestible portion of the feed. And when we analyze forages on a wet chemistry basis, this is where our energy values are being calculated based off of. It includes cellulose, lignin, again, which is the most indigestible portion of the feed, and then it also includes pectin. But when we're looking at forages, they really don't have enough pectin to be of note. But when we are thinking about other feedstuffs, such as an apple that has a lot of pectin to hold in that water, then that becomes different. But for forages, even though that's what makes up ADF, it's not enough to make a difference, really. So now when we're looking at beef cattle, we're going to be looking at their nutrient requirements, right? So we've really talked a lot about protein, and we're going to be looking up their crude protein requirement, typically in a table like nutrient requirements for beef cattle. We're also going to be looking at their energy requirement. We're going to be wanting to use our forage report to make sure their protein requirements met, their energy requirements met. We already talked about minerals as well. When it comes to their energy, it's a calculated value. The total digestible nutrients is calculated, and then your net energies, maintenance, growth, lactation, those are all calculated based off that TDN. So if you're running wet chemistry, you're going to see it being calculated based off the ADF value, and the higher the ADF, the lower the energy in the feed. If you are running a full NIR analysis, which is what we recommend, you will be getting a summative calculation for your TDN, which is going to depend on what kind of forage that it is, and if it's mixed hay, we would typically apply the legume calculation. If it seems like the grass hay actually is a better fit, we might do that too. But the point is with the summative calculations is it's taking into account more than just one feature of the forage. It's taking into account the digestibility of the forage. It's taking into account the amount of fiber, that NDF, the amount of fat, the crude protein, and the non-structural or non-fiber carbohydrates. So you're getting a more balanced equation that's going to be more accurate as to what you can expect about the performance of your animals. And then, of course, we can't talk about forages in beef cattle without talking about nitrates. Most forage producers are pretty familiar with their risks with nitrates. The biggest questions we usually see is all about feeding it to pregnant cattle and where we are seeing some abortion risks and then potentially mixing. So this table came out of the Ward Guide, which is a resource that we have available to you. And then we also have multiple other resources, such as the blog, which you can just type in there nitrates, and you'll find multiple articles where we've covered different ways that we can help guide you with that. The Ward letter will be up and running again soon. We have more webinars on forage production, understanding forage reports, choosing the right forage for your operation on YouTube. And then, of course, we've got a bank of progressive forage articles if you are looking for some more reading material. So with that, I just want to say thank you for registering and attending this webinar today. If you have registered, you will be receiving an email from me with more resources, and that's going to include a guide to help you match your crude protein requirements, your energy requirements. And Oklahoma State put that out, not Ward Laboratories, but it's a great guide that I think all producers should have. And then we're also going to share with you some more of our in-house internal resources. And with that, I would love to hear from you guys. If you enjoyed this webinar, if you have questions about some of the topics covered in this webinar, you can email me at rkern@wardlab.com. So with that, I would just like to plug, this is the first in our on-demand webinar series. You can also hear very similar information in our sheep and goat webinar. We also have a horse webinar if you have horses on your operation as well. This will just help you interpret that forage report for them. And also, if you're producing hay for your beef cattle, we will have a webinar as well for those hay production. So with that, thank you again for registering and have a great day.